The most boring corner of Wall Street just won a high-stakes showdown with the president. This is how the nerdy bond investors convinced the president to change his mind on tariffs. Now, to understand how the bond market had so much power here, you gotta understand how bonds work. I'm gonna make this super easy, and by the way, this is helpful for you for your own personal investments, so let's dive into it. The US government has a ton of debt, and it sells that debt in the form of treasuries. You probably have some exposure to treasuries in your 401k because it's considered a safe asset. Why? Because the US government always pays back its debts, and it even gives you some interest along the way. The bond market is like a seesaw that runs off of supply and demand. So the price of a bond might go up and the yield might go down because there's so much demand for that bond that they don't have to pay you as much to own it. Meantime, if the price goes down because people are selling off their treasuries, then the yield is going to go up to convince more people to hop on the seesaw and own government debt, because they need owners of government debt to facilitate the fact that we have this record-breaking deficit. And this week we saw a sell-off in the bond market. That meant that the price was put under pressure and yields were rising as a result. And when that happens really fast, it can have huge ramifications for the economy. Rising yields, they have real consequences for everything from your credit cards to your mortgage rates, even to your car loans. The rate that you are paying on those things is intrinsically tied to what happens with yields in the bond market. When rates spike, especially really fast, it can not only pressure consumer spending, it can also push us into a recession. And that's where the bond market was heading at the beginning of this week. The bond market is basically the economy's smoke alarm. It doesn't cause the fire, but it lets you know when one is coming. And this week, it was screaming for help. Remember, bonds are safe, so you would think that people would be buying bonds in an environment of such uncertainty, especially during the stock sell-off that we saw after Trump announced his tariffs. But this week, bond yields surged at a record pace, indicating that some investors may have been losing faith in the US government and our ability to pay back our debts. That put the safe haven status of bonds, and therefore the United States, into question. Fast forward to early this week. Bond yields are spiking, the stock market is selling off. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent enters the room. To be exact, Air Force One, according to reporting. And apparently, Secretary Bessent says, "Trump, I need you to pay attention to the bond market because they are screaming out that we're not only heading for a recession, we are potentially heading toward a Herbert Hoover-like depression." We don't know exactly what was said, but sources tell me somewhere along the way, the president was convinced that the bond market needed saving. Moving forward, this tells us a lot about the president's threshold for pain in the market. It wasn't necessarily the stock market sell-off that got him to change his mind the way investors thought it would. In fact, it was the nerdy bond investors. And the question that those investors were putting into the air of whether or not the US government was a safe place to be investing in. What comes next both for the bond market and for policy? Well, it's TBD right now because we got a 90-day pause on all of those tariffs outside of those with China. But one thing is clear, the bond market finally got its moment in the spotlight and pushed the President of the United States to change his mind on policy. Golf clap for the nerds, comment with your questions, and follow me for more.